how were the nerves yesterday morning?
The adrenaline kicked in yesterday morning, which got me through quite a long speech in the House of Commons. But look, this was a budget to fix the foundations and wipe the slate clean. It was a big budget. It was a significant budget. But we have now brought out into the open things that were covered up by the previous government and swept under the carpet. And because of the action that we took yesterday, our public finances are now on a firm footing. The debt and the deficit are now more sustainable and on a stable path. And so as a result of what we've done, we're not going to have to come back and ever do a budget like this again because we've brought everything out into the open.
How can you fix the foundations if growth is going to be lower?
Well, over the 5 years, the OBR say that growth is around unchanged. But for the first time, the OBR are now looking at economic growth over a longer time frame. And that's really important because look, often politicians make short-term decisions rather than things that are in the long-term interests of the country. And the OBR say that the measures that we've taken yesterday, particularly on capital spending, investing in infrastructure in our country, will actually boost economic growth by 1.4%. So around unchanged during this Parliament, but then stronger further out. But Kate, the growth numbers yesterday are not the summit of my ambition. We're less than 4 months into this new government. I want growth to be stronger and to be faster. That's why we are already cracking on with planning reforms to get Britain building again, with pension reform to unlock long-term patient capital for businesses that want to grow. We're reforming the skills system so that young people and those retraining can access the jobs that are available. And our Get Britain Working Green paper is all about getting people off long-term sickness benefits and into work. So we want to do more on growth, but what we set out yesterday on capital spending does boost our economic growth and our supply side capacity as a country.
The Office of Budget Responsibility, as you said, the acronym OBR, said that your budget would push up inflation and interest rates with a knock-on effect on growth.
Well, as I say, growth is largely unchanged in the Parliament. And on interest rates and inflation, again, over the Parliament, both of those come down. And we're in a very different place to what we saw in the last Parliament, under the last government, where inflation reached over 11% and interest rates and mortgage rates went through the roof. Inflation in this Parliament, the OBR are forecasting, peaks at around 2.6%. That is a world away from the inflation of more than 11% we saw in the last Parliament.
If it's largely unchanged, what's the point? How can you say that you're going to fix the foundations if growth is largely unchanged?
Well, over the longer term, as I say, Kay, the OBR say that economic growth will be boosted by 1.4%. That's really positive and also shows that we are now taking the long-term decisions in the national interest. The International Monetary Fund also said yesterday that this is the right budget to improve our fiscal position, which was not sustainable under the last government, and also to grow the economy. And that endorsement from the IMF is really important and shows that we are making the right decisions to put our country on the right path again.
How do you feel about making the cost of living more expensive for working people?
Well, yesterday we increased the national living wage by 6.7%, taking it to more than £12 an hour. And the 18 to 20-year-old rate of the minimum wage, we've risen now to £10 an hour, and we will converge those two rates over time so that all adults get paid a proper living wage. So we are protecting the lowest paid and improving their wages. And there were also some measures taken yesterday, for example, on universal credit and carers allowance to ensure that people on some of the lowest incomes can keep more of their own money. I'm proud to have been able to do that. But, Kate, we did have to make difficult decisions yesterday. We faced a massive black hole in the public finances when I became Chancellor of the Exchequer.
Don't say 22 billion because the OBR says that's nonsense.
That repeat every year. No, that's not true, Kay. What the OBR published yesterday was the overspends in February, and obviously the general election was in July. And we published yesterday, as the Treasury, the officials at the Treasury published a document yesterday that documented all of the hundreds of unfunded commitments from the previous government that this government inherited. And you don't just have to take my word for it, or even the Treasury's word for it. If you look at monthly borrowing figures, in the first 6 months of this year, they've come in at £11 billion more than the OBR forecast back in March because of those unfunded commitments made by the previous government. £11 billion extra in just 6 months becomes £22 billion over a year. But we have now published a line-by-line account of that £22 billion for all to see. That was our inheritance, combined with the fact that there were a load of unfunded commitments for things that were really important, like compensation for the victims of the infected blood scandal and the post office scandal. For the first time ever, I have included in our forecasts the costs of compensating those victims for those terrible scandals. That is the right thing to do, but everything has to be paid for. I've now set out how we will pay for all of the commitments that this government are making, but in many cases that the previous government have made as well, but just hadn't properly funded.
The OBR, let's keep talking about them, should we? Forecasting a rise in unemployment as a result of your budget.
Well, if you look overall at the whole package, the OBR predicts that unemployment fall. You can take individual measures from the budget, but if you add up the package and if you look at what happens over the next 5 years, the OBR are predicting that real household disposable incomes increase. That's after them being stagnant in the last parliament, the worst parliament on record for living standards, and they predict that employment will rise and unemployment will fall. But of course there's more to do. We've been in government for less than 4 months. There's more that I want to do to get our economy growing, creating good, well-paid jobs across the country. We hosted an international investment summit just 2 weeks ago that brought in £63.5 billion of private sector investment into the UK in jobs in the energy sector, in life sciences, in digital and technology. That's really welcome, but there's more that we need to do as a new government to bring that investment, bring those jobs, bring that wealth creation to Britain, and we're getting on with that job.
So what are you saying to the public? Trust me, I've got this, I'm the Chancellor.
What I say is that we faced incredibly challenging circumstances when we became the government. The public know that. They see it in their everyday lives, the pressures on public services, and everybody knows that the previous government mismanaged the economy, which is why interest rates and inflation went through the roof. We're now drawing a line under that period. We're being open and honest about the public finances, putting them on a stable trajectory, putting the money into our health service, whilst also doing everything within our power to protect working people, which is why income tax, national insurance and VAT on working people didn't increase yesterday. It's why we froze for a further year fuel duty, and it's why we did not increase, we did not freeze the thresholds for any longer than the previous government did on national insurance and income tax, because that would have been the wrong thing to do after the cost of living pressures that people have faced the last few years.
Yeah, you're asking people to trust you, Chancellor, but you promised 30 times this year before the election to not raise taxes outside your manifesto, and you have.
The circumstances that I inherited are not the ones that I chose. We inherited a huge gap between what the previous government had committed in spending and what they actually told the public about. Now, I could have swept that under the carpet and pretended it didn't exist, or try and raise a bit of money this year and a bit more next year. I didn't want to do that. I wanted to be open and honest, to wipe the slate clean, to put our public finances on a stable trajectory, to make sure that our NHS is properly funded so we can bring down those huge waiting lists with more than 7.6 million people on hospital waiting lists, and do that in a way that I felt was as fair as possible. It wasn't easy decisions yesterday. I recognise that for some businesses they'll be paying more taxes. I recognise for some of the wealthiest people in our country will be paying more taxes. But I felt they were the right decisions in the circumstances that I faced. And if other parties disagree with those tax changes, they would need to explain how they would put our public finances back on a stable trajectory, or if they would choose the path of irresponsibility that previous governments have taken over the last few years that have got us into the mess that we're in today.
You talked about the NHS. You're spending a little bit more than £2 billion over just 2 years, significant investment. But you said no money without reform, but we're not going to hear about any reforms for probably a year. You put it out to the public to ask what their opinions are going to be. So what's the plan? How can you judge it on reform if you're going to have to invest the money first?
We put a 2% efficiency and productivity target into the National Health Service for this year and next. So reform comes alongside that investment. And next year, early next year in the spring, we'll be publishing a spending review to take us through the next couple of years. And part of that spending review will be to do a zero-based review of every pound that government spends to make sure that we are properly prioritising and that we are driving reform in public services. I know that we can't just carry on doing things like we were before, and that's why, for example, in the budget yesterday I said on the NHS that we would move from analogue to digital, from hospital to community, and from treatment to prevention. And that's a really important change in philosophy of this government that does want to try and improve the living and the healthy living of our population, to put less pressure on our health service and particularly our hospitals like the one I'm in central London today.
Busy day ahead for you, Chancellor. In fact, busy rest of the year. We must let you go. Thank you.
Thank you so much.